Hello there, friends. Andrea with the Bangs here. For today's discussion, I had the chance to speak with David Fuller. He was very kind to give me this interview. I haven't spoken with him since over a year ago when I spoke with him about the intellectual dark web. For today's discussion, I really felt compelled to speak with David specifically because of the interview that he did with Jonathan Rowson about Jordan Peterson itis, I believe. That was the name of the article that Rowson wrote. But I was more interested in speaking with him about the impact that Jordan Peterson has had on the people he has inspired, I suppose, to look at things in a different way that they really weren't being looked at before. And so I reached out and David was kind enough to give me an interview. And I wish that we had both seen the Peterson-John Vervaeke interview, because I think there would have been some more discussion within our talk that pertains to that. But he actually did a chat with Paul Vander Klay since I spoke with him last Wednesday. So I will link that in the description below, because I think it would be a good follow-up to this interview that I have with David. So give me a comment. Let me know what you think about this talk. I imagine that a lot of you will have thoughts, and I would be happy to read what you have to say. And if you're new, please don't forget to subscribe and give me a like if you like it. Anyway, without further ado, here is David Fuller. Okay, so hello, friends. We just did a take 2. So thank you for being gracious, David Fuller.
No worries. I'm very gracious.
This is me. I'm saying your name. This is the intro. This is the official intro, David Fuller. Everyone knows who you are now, of Rebel Wisdom. That's your of. And the banter helps just to get in the flow.
Yeah.
So that we don't do
it's
formal
English
around
humor.
here. Yes.
It's not actually very funny, but we do it with an English accent and people kind of seem to laugh, so that's okay. I
mean, you've got a little bit of a smile, so a little smirk. So we're like, good time? Oh, okay. It's good. Okay, this is how I will deal with British folks in the future. Okay, so we had a really good intro, and we're going to recreate it, and it's going to be even better, I predict. So I wanted to discuss sort of the Jordan Peterson first and second wave with you, because after watching your little woods chat with Jonathan Rowson, I emailed you pretty much that night, because I was like, I need to talk about this with David, and we're on first name basis, David. And so I did. I wanted to not talk about the things you spoke about, because obviously you did that conversation. I don't want to have a repeat of it, but it did sort of spark things that I've been mulling around in my head quite a bit. So Peterson, first wave, second wave. I'm going to talk about second wave a little bit later with you, but first I wanted to discuss with you what happened in the culture at that time through him. Like, he touched on something. So, but you saw it before, and that's what I'm trying to get at with the start for this. I'd like to start with, how did you know? How did you know regarding Peterson? So I said this in the cold.
Yeah.
One. You bet all the marbles on him, really. So. Yeah,
and in the even better intro that we did at the beginning,
okay, wow,
you said
wow.
I put all. What did you say? I put all my marbles on.
Yeah, you put all the marbles. Yes, I tried to get it in there, but now you let them know it was better.
That's okay.
The first time.
Yeah, so I guess, like you say, we don't want to recap everything that I talked about with Jonathan, but I think a bit of context is that I think it's a good summary. I did feel like I put all of my coins on Jordan Peterson in 2017, 2018, because when I sort of found his work in mid 2017, my immediate thought was, this is exactly what we need right now. It was so appropriate for the cultural conversation. There was this sense that he was carrying like an archetypal force, which is something that Richard Tarnas, the archetypal astrologer, archetypal Jungian thinker, also reflected. Like there was something more than just him. And what that is and what that was is something we've covered a lot on Rebel Wisdom. For me, coming from the mainstream media and being very aware of how that conversation is quite narrow, the really significant thing, or one of the significant things for me, was that he was challenging the new atheist hegemony in the cultural conversation, and bringing an appreciation of myth or an appreciation of religion, an appreciation of kind of a deeper spiritual religious perspective but going toe to toe, like he also had the science as well. He wasn't coming with a sort of woolly new age perspective. He also had the scientific perspective. And there was also the sense that I think a friend of mine, Daniel Thorson, said that Peterson broke a conversational seal. So I think he was part of this kind of insurgency against a naive liberal worldview, which is a sort of low resolution liberal grand narrative that actually was wrong in lots of significant parts. And there was a sort of more, Trump represented another kind of rejection of that worldview in a much more coarse way. And the Trump movement rejected that, sort of represented that. But I think Peterson managed to articulate what was wrong with it, what was wrong with its conceptions of gender, what was wrong with its conceptions of like an inclusive worldview that was actually radically exclusive and radically othering towards people who didn't agree. Like was very judgmental towards the basket of deplorables, was very judgmental towards a whole group of people and anyone who didn't agree with them and think like they did. And that is what I think Peterson was articulating really well. And that was sort of fueling his rise, that he was able to kind of articulate that. So that I think was the power of the thing he was articulating. The flip side of that is that I think at his best, and this is something I discussed with Jonathan, at his best, I think he was able to point beyond the culture war, beyond the division, and say this is what the left is bringing, this is what the right is bringing. But because of the balance in the culture, he was largely picked up more by the right. And then I think over time became more of a player, more of an active participant in that culture war, which you can perfectly understand why, when he was misrepresented and misquoted and treated badly in many of his interviews. And I mean, I'm well aware of the trajectory of that, and it would have been almost impossible for him not to have been affected by that. But I know from having followed his trajectory very closely, speaking to a lot of people who also were following it closely, they saw him change over that time. They saw him change quite significantly and become more and more abrasive, more and more pinched, narrow, reactive. And I mean, fair play, he's human, and we're all human. But my sense, and this is where we're talking about sort of Peterson 1 and Peterson 2, like my hope, like for me, he tried to do, on some level, I feel like he tried to do it all himself. And very much his attitude when he came from, he was shot out of Toronto into the culture. And I feel like he had this kind of confrontational, mano a mano kind of style that people reacted to and responded to and felt positively towards. But also I think it was unsustainable. I think it was an unsustainable way of being in the world. And I think people started looking to him for certainty. They started looking to him for to have the answers for everything, and he didn't have the answers for everything.
Right.
And maybe, as I'm sure we'll get to, like I hope that Peterson 2 can come back in a more collaborative way, that would be my overall frame.
Okay.
There's probably a lot to pick up on there.
Well, it is, and like
don't jump to part 2 quite yet, David. We will. I do want to pick up where you brought us there, but I do just want to go back because to the how did you know, but you're giving me the answer almost like the breadth of Rebel Wisdom's, like, well, it was touching on something and we picked it up and all that, which is great. But for you, when you were in his house filled with lovely totems and British Columbia native art, you know, like what were you, like, what was going on in your head as to, because you didn't know that, like you gave a sort of hindsight answer, which makes sense because most of us do that. But when you're in his home discussing these great things with him, like, what are you thinking and what are you expecting for even personally? Because how did you know the culture as well as you can, but you, like, as far as, well, I guess, how well do you know yourself? Like, I know Peterson would, like, I beg to differ, but you know what you're thinking and what you're feeling. So what am I asking? Where were you in that space right then thinking this is worth betting all the marbles?
I mean, if you go back to that interview, which was, I think, happened in October or November 2017, that I then released as an interview, but also turned into documentary Truth in the Time of Chaos. If you look back at that interview, I didn't ask him very much at all about cultural stuff. It was much more about Jung, the shadow, synchronicities, sort of his more sort of spiritual, religious understanding and perspective.
Yeah.
And that was what I really felt he articulated beautifully, this sense of the Logos, truth. And I felt like there was something very congruent between his message and his method at that point. Like, okay, he really was doing the thing that he was talking about. He was, you got this sense of kind of, this real alignment between the man and the message. Okay. And that cut through at the time. That I just felt, and also just having a sense of the cultural conversation, having a sense of where it got stuck. It was like, this is the thing that we need to unstick so many of these kind of stuck points. And myself, I guess I'm someone who does this every now and again, like, gets very passionate about a certain thing and is convinced that it's the next big thing. And sometimes I'm right.
This is the next big thing. And then you're...
Well, sometimes I'm right, and then sometimes I'm right and I don't stick with it. Like, I had loads of Bitcoin a while ago and then I kind of sold them, and I told loads of people about Bitcoin. There's lots of people who are very wealthy because I told them about Bitcoin like 5, 6, 7 years ago. But personally, I had quite a few and then ended up selling them because I don't have that much sort of sticking power. So yeah, there was this sense. So I've done this many times of sort of seen what the next big thing might be, but then haven't really followed through.
Oh, but luckily Peterson, it happened quick. Happened quick. You're like, oh, I didn't have to jettison you. He stuck around. Well, he stuck around until he didn't. Like, so there's this is so perfect. So there's the first and the second wave, but the second wave, there's a space in between, because he was going full tilt, like you were saying, and then had to leave because of his wife's illness and then his own. And but he left, but many didn't. And we were all still there on Twitter. Like, we were all still there. And the IDW fell apart when he was gone. And that was the last time I spoke with you, was about, what is this IDW thing? Is it even a thing? And what could it be, and all those things. But it's now I get even more clarity looking back. It was just one thing. Because you were in your little sum up video. It wasn't a sum up video. It was like promoting the courses that you guys are. It just came out yesterday, is it?
Yeah. So.
Yeah. So it was perfect. I'm like, oh, this is fueling my interview with David for tomorrow. So you guys brought this up about the factions and the little tribes that formed. So no. They were more coherent together, but then now Trump is gone, and now COVID is winding down ish, and so they're turning into like more fractals, whereas they were a little bit more coherent. And we saw that a little bit earlier on with the IDW sort of breaking apart. And so this is the intermission for Peterson, and so my question there is, like, I'm kind of insinuating why, but I'd like to know why from your perspective. And I know we had an entire discussion as to what's going on with the IDW before, but I feel like it's even more straightforward and simple now. So please, straightforward and simple answer, David.
Can you summarize the question again?
Okay. Yeah. So things are breaking. Things in the interim Peterson period. We're going whole force as almost like these behemoths of groups combining and alliances, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend with the atheists and the Christians and whatnot, and others, and they really formed these groups, IDW being one of them. And then, intellectual dark web, for those of you who don't know. But then now they've broken apart, I'd say, and are just down to little individuals of people, and they're not really groups anymore. So I just want to know, in that interim period, why they stayed together so well, and now they've sort of fizzled out.
Yeah. I mean, the intellectual dark web is something, again, that we covered quite a lot on Rebel Wisdom. And I think they sold themselves as being non-tribal, but I think, as many people have pointed out, they were a tribe. They were, they had their own sort of tribal alliances, and there was a sense that they split along different lines, especially in the run-up to the election in 2020. And Peterson was absent for that. I wonder, if he hadn't been absent, how that might have played out, and whether it might have played out in a different way. Mm-hmm. But my sense now, like the fragmentation you're talking about, and we put out on the film a couple of days ago, is, I think Trump, in a way, was this incredibly polarizing force, and the arguments. People fell out on different sides of this, like some people saying, well, Trump is our only chance against the radical left, against wokeness. And I always thought that was wrong, because he was like, he fed it, and he basically, from their perspective, proved everything about their critique of America being this racist, ignorant. Like Trump was an example of the thing, and very easy to make the case on the other side. And I also feel like he was like the real battle line in culture. Why Barry Weiss was forced out of the New York Times, why Andrew Sullivan had to leave New York Magazine, why he had all these revolts in different news organizations over last summer, which I covered in something called the Sense Making series. The real fault line, where most of the heat is between wokeness, broadly defined, social justice ideology, and old school liberalism. And Trump rode in on the back of that, and was kind of, as a prime, I mean, as a scam artist, effectively, he was able to kind of weaponize that division, right, and be elected. But ultimately, it's a civil war within the left. which is something that Brett and Eric Weinstein have talked about. And I think Trump was a distraction from that civil war within the left. That now that Trump is out of the way, that's the battle that ultimately needs to be fought. It's not so much between left and right. I mean, there's obviously divisions between left and right, and there's divisions all over the map that my friend Peter Lindbergh talks about, the different mimetic tribes of what he calls Culture War 2.0, which is a more sort of multipolar war. But I think the most heat is along that dividing line between social justice when it turns into an all-encompassing ideology versus liberalism, which is more about individuals, individual difference, meritocracy, that kind of, and that is where I think we've seen a lot of the fragmentation. We've seen a lot of people on the anti-woke side, I think, get captured by serious ideology and become the thing they're fighting against. Someone like James Lindsay being the perfect example from my perspective. And so you've seen James Lindsay fall out with Claire Lehman. You've seen Sam Harris fall out with most of the rest of the IDW. Yeah. You've seen all of this sort of. So I think Trump, in a weird paradoxical way, was a unifying factor in many ways. That now that he's gone, I think it's safer in some ways to make the argument against social justice extremism when you're not being accused of basically benefiting Trump. So I think there's a freedom now for those of us who are suspicious of that ideology, but were I guess from the other side vulnerable to the attack that you're helping get Trump reelected or whatever. Like, that's now no longer there. So I think it's allowed for a lot more diversity of opinion and for a lot more of these fractures to open up. And I think we've seen that really happen after the election. Is that helpful? I don't know how Peterson relates to that so much.
No, it does. It does. No, I've got it all. I've visuals. The visual discussion in my head is forming, so don't worry. So don't you worry, David Fuller. So I will bring it all together. So you touched on the heart of Peterson's message. You saw, in your little, I can see things happen sometimes. You saw this sort of more, I will say spiritual, but psychological / spiritual sort of things. Yet in his absence, but many people picked up on the political side of him. Like, that's what that's what almost drove his popularity, is a mix of clean up your damn room, and he's, speaking, standing up against the establishments taking away our freedom of speech and whatnot, but you saw, you weren't looking at that from how it sounds, but many were, and many of these factions we're talking about were, I see it as holding up, looking at the top layer, whereas like there's this depth that many did pull towards, but was getting, because of Trump, it was like all brought up there. But then Trump goes away, and all this COVID stuff is still kind of here, but not as intense. And so, nothing to unite in that big way around there. And so now and then Peterson is, I will say, like, he's a broken man now. And I don't think it's bad to be broken, because I think that's where we can grow and we can be truly humbled. So he's a different person. He's not both of those things. He seems to be in that yearning space. And many are still in the political space, but I've moved on. And I feel like Rebel Wisdom very much, you guys have actually not really gotten as involved, but like you said it early on, you did the IDW sort of pieces and whatnot. But I feel like you guys have been able to sort of stick with that more higher level, but deeper level spiritual space. And and that's what I think is left when, like, the burning away of what's the, I don't want to say trivial human matters, but when you are looking to have what's left, what's left when you clear away the sort of bickering over like right and left, it does seem to have this depth. And so that brings us to the second Peterson wave, or Peterson number 2. And so that's what I want to, I guess, look into, because like it's, I kind of accidentally explained he's different. He is different. But it seems like we're different. And some of us aren't. Some of us are still like wrapped up in that, political layer. But it feels like we've gone through almost, like, I mean me. Like, I feel different from the first time. But I don't know that I'm alone. So that's what I want to get your opinion on, is that we've kind of been brought on this journey with Peterson, and it's because of him, but it's not because of him. It's like you said, he's touched on something. And we're going through it. And so I'm wondering what is this new, and I do think that Rebel Wisdom is pushing forward in this space. So that's what I want to know. What is happening in this second Peterson era?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing his conversation with John Vervaeke, because John Vervaeke is someone I think is really pushing things forward, and his interest in dialogos as a kind of form of alive, emergent dialogue is exactly what I think we need, is to recover. And that's what I think a lot of us were attracted to with the IDW and with Peterson originally, was this sense of novelty, something being new, something being original, the sense that people were going to new areas. And that sense of novelty, I think a lot of us now feel is no longer there, or we struggle to know where it is in the culture. So I think, and Peterson obviously talked to John recently, and apparently, I haven't seen it, but it was a long conversation. It sounds like he enjoyed the conversation, and it sounds like they're going to have another one. I think most of the interesting stuff is happening in the cracks. I think part of the problem with the IDW was it was already, as soon as it was named, it ceased to be, because it was no longer dark by definition.
Okay.
And the criticism from the beginning was, what on earth are you talking about? How can Joe Rogan, the biggest podcaster in the world, be dark? How can Sam Harris be dark? How can Jordan Peterson be dark? And that was true. Like, they were dark because they were kind of being ignored. But at the same time, if you have that kind of public profile, if you have that attention on you, it's very, very hard to keep growing in public. And I think there's a sense that very few of the original members of that group did grow in any significant way. Once we learned what they thought about certain things,
okay.
I think they became established with certain positions, with certain arguments, that then they kind of calcified around
those positions.
Yeah, and that sense that explore it, it's very difficult to explore new territory in public as well. And I think there are some who can do that, but I think it's very rare, and there are costs to doing that, especially if you're questioning previously held positions. So I think by definition, a lot of the more interesting stuff is going on at a lower level. I'd say John Vervaeke is someone to check out. A lot of the conversations that my friend Peter Lindbergh is having at the Stoa, that's a really interesting place to check out. And then to realize what stops people growing. There are incentive structures that stop people growing. People just get used to a certain type of content.
What do you mean incentive structures? Like
following incentives, following views, or following controversy, or following certain narratives. Like, being cancelled is good for business, for example.
Okay.
audience capture exists as a thing. Once you establish a certain position, once you've got a certain audience, it's difficult to challenge that audience. They don't like being challenged. People don't like being challenged, really. YouTube has a comments thread. If you're a YouTube creator, you get to learn what your audience likes, what they don't like. A lot of people are funded by Patreon subscriptions. You get to learn what people like and don't like.
Right.
There's a series of films that anyone who cares about this conversation, I think, should watch, by a guy called Timber on Toast, about
yes.
Dave Rubin.
Yes.
The Battle of Ideas. That sketches out audience capture. It sketches out what happens to someone who, I believe, started as a good faith actor, Dave Rubin, how he got captured by his audience, how he started producing content that they wanted to see, how if you go down that level, if you go down that path, it's very difficult to come back. It's very difficult to pursue truth if you're worried about what other people will think, and it's very, very difficult to pursue truth if you get aligned, aligned incentives, meaning if you have a quid pro quo with certain people that you don't criticize because you want to get on their podcast, and you get these little ecosystems of belief that all have their taboos and all have their things you can say and things you can't say, and you learn. And I think all of these people got subject to that. I mean, Jordan Peterson included. Like, what now? The Peterson industry is a thing. Like,
right.
There are these financial interests. There are these egotistical interests. Not every trap is a monetary trap. It's also egotistical. It's also popularity. It's also like all of these different things, which I actually thought you talked about the interview that Jonathan Pajot and Jordan Peterson did. I think Pajot hinted at that in that interview where Jordan said something about his fans,
yes,
as a community. And I felt like Jonathan was saying, whoa, careful. Like, that's not a community. That's not a congregation.
No.
That's a very unhealthy dynamic, which I think it certainly is, but it's one that we can all get trapped in. He was saying you need peers. Well, I don't know this for sure. I've only watched it and I haven't spoken to Jonathan about this, but I imagine that's what he meant when he was saying, when he was asking that question. You just got a sense of him kind of like, oh, no, that's not a healthy relationship. That's what I think Jordan Peterson or any of these figures with huge followings, you're able to then when you're overwhelmed with the amount of potential input, both positive and negative, it's very easy. We wouldn't be human if we didn't screen out some of it.
Right.
Especially if a lot of it feels like it's bad faith or a lot of it feels like it's not quite on the money, we then start to only really perceive the stuff that's positive.
Right.
So this kind of, it's infinitely more easy than it ever was to lose your bearings in this new world where we're constantly overstimulated with the amount of input that we're getting from all of these different mediums.
Okay, so how does Rebel Wisdom not become audience captured?
Well, I don't think
you are.
I think the first thing to say is that none of us are immune.
Okay.
I did an interview with, like, when I talk about Dave Rubin, which I have a bit, I did an interview with Dave Rubin where I challenged him on a few of these things, and he was very unhappy with it.
Yeah.
Didn't want it to go out, blocked me on Twitter, but when I did an interview with Jay Shapiro, reflecting on the trajectory of the intellectual dark web and reflecting on Dave Rubin, we said he's a cautionary tale, and it's like, there but for the grace of God go all of us. I'm vulnerable to the comments thread as much as anyone. And we all have that capacity. We're all limited creatures. How do we make sure that we are making sense properly? How do we know that we're not being captured? Like, we all have the capacity to do that. And I feel more comfortable when a creator is reflecting on that themselves, that they are they're aware of the possibility and they're aware of that, that they have the potential to go that route. We have a membership model as well. My sense is that our members they're very different from the comments thread. The comments thread leads in a particular direction. Our members are much more, generally they come from sort of the integral background, sort of Ken Wilber, developmental thinking. So they're a very different crowd, I think, to the general YouTube viewer. But yeah, I think we all need to be constantly alert to the possibility that we're being swayed by these incentives.
Right. Okay.
Andrea, how do you make sure that you're not being audience captured?
Oh, don't even. I was legitimately thinking as you were describing this, like, oh, I have a maybe interview with someone where they run a fan club of one of these people and one of these IDW folks, and it's probably going to be negative because they've been trying to work with these people anyways, and like reflecting on some of these things that, like, hey, like, I've been a really loyal fan club runner, and it seems like there's this and this issue. Anyway.
So they're kind of blowing the whistle. I'm
not sure. Yes, and I'm not sure if I want to do that on my channel because I am like let's look at both sides, and I don't like being polarized in any direction, no matter how compelling it is. But then I'm like, is that just the fear? Am I just like, oh, I want to keep potential channels open. So anyway, I haven't decided still. I'm still.
And that's another thing to be aware of. If you're in that position, the warping potential of success as well. Like, I know that feeling of like, oh, I'm worried about keeping these channels open. Do I really want to put out an interview that's critical of this person or that this person really disagrees with? And this is another, again, this is the paradox with the kind of stated goals of the intellectual dark web, which was open conversation and good faith. And yet we need to be aware that these things come in. Like, that's my real disappointment with it as a movement, is I don't think it lived up to those goals. And I don't think you can live up to those goals unless you have a much more sophisticated understanding of human psychology, of how we, as Jay Shapiro said in the interview I did with him, just because you've beaten bad philosophy doesn't mean you've beaten bad psychology.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's interesting. So,
and knowing that you're that popular, or knowing that you have that much clout, you should have it in your mind that people are less likely to tell you when you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing. Like, you should bring that into your understanding or your kind of calculations. Yeah.
So you're like, just really think about it more. I mean, there's no right answer, about like whether you do this or that with these. But yeah, your answer was good in the sense of no one's immune. No one's immune. So just knowing that we are fallible and that we're human, because it's when you think you're not, the pride cometh before a fall sort of situation. But the way that, so for me, like my answer, even though your answer was a little bit better, my thought that you were going to go in the direction of was, you like Rebel Wisdom is looking at, we're not looking to persuade people. We're looking to have better conversations but that's I'm projecting. That's what I am seeing you guys do in having people who are like, I mean, in your in the film you just put out, that little clip that John Vervaeke was talking about listening to music and how there's no persuasion. It's just, it is the end. It's not a means to an end. It's just, it just is. and doing conversations in a way that we listen to music, where you're deeply listening, and it sounds so beautiful. And I'm like, I want this, I'm feeling yeah, I want to grasp that, but I was speaking about this the other day with someone in our early education and into like, as we get older and older, where you're taught how to write a paper in a persuasive way. Like, yes, you do reports on facts and like in the beginning, but then as you write a paper, here's a thesis statement, and here's where you have to outline 3 main arguments, and that's how it goes until university, until, post-grad and postdoc work. And it's you persuade. And that's what we're primed for in our Western culture. And and you guys, I'm saying, how do you do that? How do we, you're like, we're doing discussions on that. So come and take a look, take our courses. But I am asking you that, that is the thing that seems that's beyond the IDW got caught up in the persuasion thing. We're just trying to have a dialogue. We're just trying to have open conversation. But their definition, and this is where it depends what you mean by open dialogue, was about just listen to reason. Like that was what you guys were outlining. And well, what does it mean to listen to reason? Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it in a different way. And you guys are saying this in a different way. And I'm like, it will be like, you can't just answer this, but I do want you to answer it for our purposes since we're here. How do we have conversations where we are listening and not trying to make someone else see the other side when it's these sort of maybe polarizing issues, but not necessarily? But how do we listen? How do we have conversations where we're as if we're listening to music?
As if we're listening, or when we're actually listening?
So, see, I don't even know. Like, how do we go the way of listening to music? How do we approach conversations in the same way?
I would say, so this is something that John Vervaeke in particular is focused on. Like, how do we get ourselves into an open mindset? How do we have conversations that go somewhere new? Partly, I think you have to build trust and you have to build a safe container for that to happen.
Okay.
But also, there are hacks, one of which is that if you find yourself getting defensive in a conversation, can you start to become curious about that? Can you make that kind of internal hack to, I'm starting to feel reactive towards this. I wonder what that might be about. And maybe even bring that into the conversation. I've noticed that I felt like that when you brought that up. And I just wanted to make that, if you articulate something and make it a conscious part of the conversation, then it's not playing out under the surface.
Right.
That's one thing.
Okay.
The becoming curious is an actual physical hack, because we can only be in an exploratory frame of mind or a defensive frame of mind. We're wired in that binary way. There's a school of thought called polyvagal theory, which is all about how the vagus nerve moderates that feeling of safety or unsafety. And when we get defensive, we stop. We can't, almost physiologically, can't take in new information at that point. We become reactive. So can we internally notice that and become curious about that shift? I wonder what it was about that triggered me in that way. Was it a sense that they weren't listening to me? Was it a sense that, whatever that might be, it may be something to do with my conditioning, it may be to do with the judgment about the other person, but can you build that into the dialogue that you're having with that person? Mm-hmm. I think my sense, and this is, you mentioned the courses that we do, and that's why we run the courses. We bring in techniques from mindfulness. We bring in techniques from interpersonal relating skills. We bring in all of these different things, ultimately to make sense of the world. It's called Sense Making 101. But the first 4 or 5 weeks are really about knowing ourselves. When are we being triggered? When are we being limbically hijacked? When are we being outraged by the information that's come in? How do I become aware of that? How do I start to deal with that in myself before then dealing with it in conversation with others, before then dealing with it in kind of trying to understand the world? Like my strong sense, and I guess someone like Sam Harris has ended up in a very similar place with his mindfulness apps, and this sense that you can't, the only way forward is to move in a more conscious direction and bring in techniques from some of these other more mindfulness, therapeutic almost disciplines. Like that's what we need, because we're being manipulated and influenced so much all the time in this kind of in the information landscape that we're in.
Okay.
So
right.
So I think I think we need to like, it's always a kind of imperative to know ourselves, like the classic kind of know thyself message from kind of the ancient Greeks. That has become an imperative now, I think.
Okay, so I think that we're closing in on maybe an hour. I don't know, and I know I said we'd do around an hour, but so to wrap up, I was wondering, for you as an interviewer, again we're just dividing up everything with Peterson. So pre-Peterson versus post-Peterson, but it's not post because he's still around, but. How long did you, were you, like, I guess, would you call yourself, like, were you an interviewer or more of a reporter for the BBC, before you left?
I did pretty much everything. I was a producer, director for documentaries. Before that, I was a reporter, producer, director, cameraman, editor.
Okay, so not a bad little...
Yeah, lots of different things. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that interviewing is my probably my main skill would have been narrative, documentary. Interviewing something I do okay.
Okay, well, it may not have been
I wouldn't say it's like my main thing.
But regardless, it's still, well, I need it for my question, so we'll just say that it was important. So yeah,
I'd call myself an interviewer if that helps you.
Thank you. Oh, we're just making up narratives now. So no, but so pre-Peterson versus maybe post-Peterson, because it's not necessarily Peterson. It just, that's the measure of the time, because the people you've been having these discussions with, having these chats with. I mean, you've definitely become an interviewer over the past few years. And do you look at the way you talk to people, particularly the people you're interviewing? Have you changed your style, I guess, with the idea in mind that you're describing about sort of like asking yourself, like, oh, why did I get defensive there? That's interesting. Or not necessarily that, but just that as an example. But have you opened up, I suppose, to this different level of relating to someone conversationally in the past few years?
Well, yes. I mean, it always comes and goes. Like, sometimes I feel in a good sort of relating space and sometimes not so much. Right. But I did train as a counselor in, I think, 2016 or 2017. 2017, I think. Maybe.
Oh, you throw in another job. You're like, director, producer. Yeah, sometimes I interviewed. Also a counselor. Okay. Yeah,
I've never done too many one-to-one sessions.
Right.
I have led groups and sort of been a group facilitator.
Okay.
But that counselling training was all about, based on Carl Rogers' person-centered counselling. So based on the idea that we find the truth together and it emerges out of the dialogue between you.
The Rogerian school. I only know that because my sister's a counselor, but yes.
Yeah, and I think that definitely helped me in my sort of one-to-one interviews. And I felt like, in particular, I can remember a couple of interviews that went really well, I think, because I was able to bring that level of presence to it. And the idea that just being fully present is the therapeutic modality. It is the thing that allows things to be processed between you when you're in that kind of relationship. So I think it definitely improved my skills on that.
Okay, so
but again,
yeah.
No, it's okay.
Okay, so is it being present? Is it being present with relationship? I'm just trying to sum up all my questions here, David. And you're here now. So is, for what's happening, we're our old model seems to be not working, and we're looking back at like, you know, different traditions. We're looking forward. Some people are trying to make new ones, like Vervaeke's religion that's not a religion, that draws from other religions, I guess. People are trying to find answers as to how to be. And is it... So, like, you know, we can just solve it right now. So is it being present in a cultivated relationship? Not necessarily, I don't mean like husband and wife necessarily. It could be that, but that's the I guess one of the most intense versions. But is it cultivating what exists and putting into those things and being present in those sort of spaces? The old school, like, Dunbar number, look at your 100 people and just really put into them. Like, is that just it? Is that the answer? Did I just come up with it?
I'll say yes.
Okay, you're like, let's wrap up. But okay, can you, I promise this is it. This is the end. So do you have any comments on that?
Whether presence is the answer, is that the question?
Yeah, yep. It was a long version of that.
I'd say the secret to success, or the secret to, like, the more we can get out of our own way, the better.
What does that mean, David?
Well, if you're in doing an interview, if you're constantly thinking about what you want to say next rather than listening to the person who's speaking, that's not going to create a good conversation or a good interview.
Right.
Trying to get out of our own way, like, we're often our own worst enemies.
Okay.
And we often get in our own way. So can we get out of our own way?
All right.
There's a concept of group. There's a concept of flow that, again, John Vervaeke talks about. Jamie Wheel talks about the sort of sense of when we're in that state where we feel that something we're doing is deeply meaningful and that we're really connected with it, and we know what to do next without knowing it consciously, without knowing it in a sort of on a propositional level. Like, I think ultimately that for me feels like the goal is can we try and get more and more into that place? And that for me is all about more presence.
Right. Okay. Namaste. No, just kidding. Okay. That seems like a good, or amen. I am a Christian. I should probably go the Christ route. Anyway. Amen. That's it. So let it be. I think that is a good place to end. So thank you so much for your time, both off screen and figuring out my technical difficulties and this now. This was great. Thank you, David.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Thank you for the conversation.
If you would subscribe, that would be the bee's knees.